Good evening. Welcome to Brass Tacks. I'm Zaka Jacob. Maldives has now demanded that India withdraw all of its troops from the islands by the 15th of March. India has about 80-odd troops. Most of them are non-weaponized, in a non-combative position. They're largely there for training purposes. They're involved in humanitarian missions, in medical evacuation efforts. This announcement by the Maldives came after President Mohamed Muizzu returned after a state visit to Beijing. It also comes amidst a raging controversy with India over tourism between Maldives and Lakshadweep. But the moot point is this: can the Maldives in the Indian Ocean region afford to ignore the biggest country in this region, which is India, and India's interests in the region? How much of this behavior is driven by the need to please Beijing, and how much by domestic political compulsion, because Muizzu is under pressure after his party lost the Malé mayoral elections and it is due to now fight the parliamentary elections, which are due in April? And how should India respond to this creeping Chinese influence in India's literal sort of backyard, as it were? But first, the story so far. All right, so what exactly is it that Maldives wants? Now, it wants Indian troops who are stationed there and who've been there for the last 30 years plus out. There are 88 unarmed Indian personnel who are stationed in the Maldives. Most of them are involved in humanitarian efforts or in training purposes. Troops comprise of military engineers, trainers, pilots. They also provide support for the equipment that's been provided by New Delhi. Now, what are these military assets that are present there? There are two Dhruv advanced light helicopters. There is also a Dornier transport aircraft that's been leased from New Delhi to Malé. The troops basically there train the Maldivian National Defense Force. Indian troops also assist in humanitarian activities in that region. Remember, this is an area that is prone to cyclones and other natural disasters. So the Indian troops are actively involved in humanitarian efforts there. And of course, medical evacuation is a big part of that. Muizzu made this statement right after a 4-day state visit to China last week. This is what he said upon landing in Malé. We have a vast economic zone of 900,000 square kilometers. Maldives with the biggest share of this ocean. He's referring to the Indian Ocean. This ocean does not belong to a specific nation. He was referring, of course, in this case, to India. That the Indian Ocean belongs to all the nations that are situated in that region. Maldives is not in anyone's backyard, because he's trying to speak to a constituency here in India, as well as, of course, more importantly, a domestic constituency, which tends to play on the back of this India is the big boss, the big brother around this region narrative. The Maldives, he says, is an independent and sovereign state, and no country can bully it. Now, the point is this: how much of this is Mr. Muizzu doing to please his masters in Beijing, and how much of this is actually catering to a domestic political constituency, which Mr. Muizzu is really fighting with the previous dispensation of Abdullah Yamin? Now, number one, China and Chinese banks hold over 60% of Maldivian sovereign debt. In fact, as many as 10 islands in the archipelago, which has more than 100 islands, as many as 10 of them have been leased out to China. So it is a kind of debt for land kind of a business deal that China has arrived at with the Maldives. China wants to use some of the Maldivian islands to dock research vessels. Remember, one such vessel, it had created a huge furor when it docked in Sri Lanka. When Muizzu went to Beijing, one of the things that they agreed to was a free trade agreement to be ratified between Beijing and Malé. If that were to happen, then two-way trade between Beijing and Malé will increase manifold. Muizzu's election campaign, when he got elected as president back in November, was openly anti-India. In fact, the slogan that he and his party had coined was India out. So, the big question now is, how does India deal with this? Yes, there is a political dispensation there which is unfriendly, to say the least, towards India, but India is the resident power of this region. How does India safeguard its own interests from the creeping tentacles of China? Joining me now, Kanwal Sibal is former Foreign Secretary, Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow with the Observer Research Foundation, Ghanshyam Tiwari is spokesperson of the Samajwadi Party, Mr. Sujit Kumar is a Rajya Sabha Member of Parliament from the Biju Janata Dal. Kanwal Sibal, let me start with you first. So, one of the things that our viewers will be interested in is in knowing if these Indian troops in the Maldives have been there since 1988-89, and they are largely there for non-combat reasons. They're there for humanitarian purposes, for medical evacuation, etc. Why then is Mr. Muizzu hell-bent on removing these troops, or is he then making a political point, using these troops as some kind of a political cannon fodder? What is the real reason for why he seems to have taken this rather brazen tone and line when it comes to India's non-combatant troops who are stationed there in the Maldives?
Zaka, you're asking me to rationalize something which is irrational. Maldives can have relations with China. They've had relations with China before, very strong ones, until the previous government came to power. Their predecessor was openly very pro-Chinese and creating a problem for us. But as a part of their own domestic politics and so-called democracy, that government was ousted and Saudi government came to power, which wanted to strengthen ties with India and declared India as their most important partner and declared India first foreign policy. Now it's been reversed. Muizzu has won. So I think partly what is happening is as a result of domestic politics. Second, in order to win the election, Muizzu has tapped into that very electorate, which one of his predecessors, I'm forgetting his name.
Abdullah Yameen. Yeah.
Abdullah Yameen capitalized on in terms of his pro-China and anti-Indian policies. So clearly there is a division of public opinion in Maldives. The third factor is that Maldives has become very Islamist. So they are very receptive to Islamist influences. In this case, it is clear that Turkey is exerting a lot of influence because the first country he has visited is Turkey, and we know what the Turkish role today is in terms of taking the leadership of the Islamic world, along with Pakistan and Malaysia. These are the three countries which actually want to take away the leadership from Saudi Arabia, which is modernizing itself. That Islamism is the third factor. And the fourth factor, of course, is that China had suffered a diplomatic defeat with the arrival of the Saudi government. And clearly they have been working behind the scenes very assiduously to recover lost ground. And they have obviously financed this person's campaign. Now, my final point is that, as I said, they've had relations with China before. We have not intervened. We have let the democratic process take its own course. We know that we cannot stop the Chinese from penetrating our neighborhood. But that doesn't mean he has to antagonize India, alienate India, insult the Prime Minister of India, and throw India out. Because at the end of the day, when there's a crisis situation, and India has demonstrated that in the Indian Ocean, we are the first responders. So tomorrow, if there's a crisis, who will come to his aid? China? It's ridiculous. It's totally short-sighted. It's petulant. It is ultra-nationalist to the point of irrationality. Why antagonize India?
Okay, so Sushant Sareen,
with China and have normal relations with India.
Then the question is, like Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal said, Mr. Muizzu is free to play his domestic politics. Maybe this has got to do with the upcoming Majlis elections in April, and he has to cater to that constituency. And that's a vote bank he's fighting with Abdullah Yameen to try and take control of. So one part is domestic, so he's free to play those politics. But the larger worry for India is, Sushant Sareen, how does India safeguard and protect its interests? Because if these troops were to leave, then the natural corollary, and this is the fear in strategic circles in India, is that the ground is then fertile for China to establish some kind of a military presence in the Maldives, whether that is through the form of these naval ships, so-called research vessels, or whether they will actually have troops out there in the Maldives, have a base in the Maldives like they do in Djibouti. That is still an open question, but it sort of leaves the field open, and that is India's worry. So how does India safeguard its interest there?
So, Zaka, two clarifications. One, Muizzu had fought the election in alliance with Yameen's party.
Yeah.
But I think there's been a falling out between the two, which is why you will see Muizzu becoming actually even more stridently anti-India. Earlier, he was of course one of the proponents of the India Out campaign, but over the last couple of months, he's become even more stridently anti-India. I think he's trying to take over that constituency, which was Yameen's constituency.
Yeah.
The second part of it is, Zaka, look, the thing is that we don't have a military base in Maldives. We have a handful of military personnel. Most of them are there for humanitarian assistance and stuff like that, rescue missions and stuff like that. We don't have a military base. The fear, however, is that the Chinese are negotiating to build a port and perhaps a naval base out there, and a naval base in an area which straddles the sea lines which run from the Arabian Sea onto the rest of the Indian Ocean, from the west to the east. So I think that is a matter of serious concern. Now, some of it can be mitigated if we were to invest and develop our own facilities in the Lakshadweep. But I don't think we can let go of the Maldives and allow a hostile power like the Chinese, and not just a hostile power, it's an extra regional power, to come and set up base in Maldives right on virtually on our back door. So clearly, I think India will have to take some step. But I think even within the Maldives, there is some kind of a pushback now which is starting.
Correct.
We are hearing of, there's an election which these guys have lost. Malé, which is of course the only and most important city in the country. They've lost that election. There is the opposition which is coalescing. And there are, I believe there is now a process in place to have a no confidence motion. So for all you know that whatever deadline Muizzu has given us, he might not even be president by the time, that deadline reaches.
Okay.
And 2 months is a very long time. A lot could happen in that time.
Ghanshyam Tiwari, anti-India politics, we have seen this play out in different neighborhood countries at different points of time. There used to be a time when Bangladesh, we used to see very stridently anti-India politics practiced by the Bangladesh National Party. Even in Nepal, when KP Sharma Oli was the Prime Minister, even in his first term when Prachanda was Prime Minister, there was a constituency of anti-India politics that they practiced. Of course, things have changed in the last 15 years in Bangladesh, certainly, and even in Nepal, the anti-India rhetoric coming from mainstream politicians in Nepal has come down quite substantially. So, should we just see this as part of, a political process in the Maldives, as Secretary Kanwal Sibal said a moment ago? The Abdullah Yameen regime was far more stridently anti-India. In fact, they made substantially more sort of agreements with China and deepened their engagement with China, much more than what Muizzu's government has done in the last 3 months. So, should we just wait out the political cycle in Maldives?
Good evening, Zaka, to you, the fellow co-panelists and the viewers, and a very happy Makar Sankranti to everyone. 3 things stand out in the current situation. One, I'm looking at the foreign policy MEA website on India-Maldives relations. 2, any read on the trade deficit between India and Maldives also tells you a story. 3, the number of strategically important institutions that India has supported for Maldives, it has a long track record, and the bilateral relations stand not just on the India-Maldives equation. They also stand on how India has supported Maldives at the UN and other places, and how Maldives has supported India at the UN and other places. So this is a long-standing relationship, as is put out on the MEA website. The only thing that worries me is that how today India's foreign policy is as much about India versus the certain country as it is about the social media play of an entire right-wing establishment lampooning that entire country. There could be social media posts out there which are critical and disrespectful of the Indian Prime Minister. We must oppose those posts. But when a country as big as India mobilizes people and a lot of people start lampooning an entire country, it puts the whole relationship between the two, long-standing relationship between the two nations at jeopardy. And this is something that which is entirely BJP is doing, whether it is with respect to the Israel-Gaza situation, or it is with respect to the Maldives situation. We cannot have trolls who have no accountability dominate the narrative of Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis any other nation, whether it is Bangladesh, knowing fully well that China is on the sidelines, not our friends.
So Ghanshyam, so the disparaging comments that some of their ministers made against Prime Minister Modi, for which action was taken against them, what would you have be? What would the ideal response have been? If you're saying that, this drum roll of extremely right-wing rhetoric, fellows who have no stake in Indian diplomacy are driving diplomacy and driving policy towards a critical neighbor like Maldives, that's not the way to go. Then what is the way to go? How would you respond to those comments?
First and foremost, I see this dangerous sign both with respect to Israel-Gaza tragic situation as well as Maldives, that the narrative is taken over by disinformation agents of the right wing who will speak about India and Maldives. If there are comments, Indian government should officially rebut those comments, and if there is further political meme war that has to happen, let it be on individuals. Why should it happen on Maldives as a country? Okay. And then Prime Minister visiting Lakshadweep and suddenly comparing these two. The moment you take on a country through unaccountable trolls, that is when you fracture the Indian foreign policy model, and that has never done before.
So Mr. Sujit Kumar, please respond to what Ghanshyam Tiwari is saying, that all this echo chamber, this surround sound that we are seeing on Twitter is actually hurting Indian foreign policy, because the official position from the MEA has not reacted to the comments that have been made by these ministers. Of course, these were disparaging comments, and of course action needed to be taken. Action has been taken. But that does not represent the view of majority Maldivians, just like the Twitter trolls here in India don't represent the view of the majority of Indians.
Absolutely. Well, the government of India responded diplomatically. We summoned the ambassador to India and registered our protest. What Ghanshyam Tiwari is saying could be partially correct. There might be some truth in the fact that the right-wing trolls and BJP sympathizers might have made disparaging comments about the country as a whole. But you can't blame a country as large as India for this. We are a free nation with a free speech. So obviously there will be some reaction to what happened to the comments, the tweets by the three ministers, suspended ministers now. But I'd like to go back to what Secretary Sibal said about Turkey. Mind you that Turkey was the first country President Muizzu went to, breaking the convention. And the Turkey, Azerbaijan, Pakistan troika are trying to foment trouble in every corner of the world by making the Islamic the Caliphate the Caliphate movement. So Maldives being our immediate neighbor and being an integral part of the larger Indo-Pacific, I think that is a matter of great worry for us.
Okay.
And also the fact.
Finish your point. Go ahead, please.
The fact that the opposition parties in Maldives have responded maturely, and the fact that the comments by the three ministers, the suspended ministers, didn't find much approval within the country, speaks of the historical and civilizational ties between the two countries. So it's it's heartening to note that not everyone in Maldives has this anti-India sentiment.
Okay.
And we have been a responder, the first responder in multiple crises. In fact, the largest hospital in Maldives is named after late Mrs. Gandhi. It was built by India.
Okay. Let me go back to Secretary Kawal Sibal. The reason why this is particularly intriguing is all of this has been announced right after Mr. Muizzu's visit to China. And like you said, any country is free to pursue its diplomatic relationship with any other country. But the worry, Secretary Sibal, is, countries have been stuck in a massive debt trap by China. Sri Lanka is a classic example of that. We've seen multiple countries in Africa, from Angola to Zambia, all being stuck in a Chinese debt trap. Even the Maldives, as of last count, there's $3.5 billion of direct or indirect funding that's come from China, loans that have come from China, which need to be returned. So this debt trap diplomacy that the Chinese follow, debt then eventually leading to some kind of land or territorial stake, is that not something that smaller countries have learned from the example of Sri Lanka, from the example of Zambia, etc.?
Well, not really. It is true that countries have become more conscious of this, the recipient countries. But the thing is, there are two things. One is that these countries are desperately in need of infrastructure. If they go to the World Bank or the ADB, then the projects have to be viable, economically viable, have to be structured in a way that they bring returns, that they are transparent, the decisions on them are transparent, there is no corruption, etc., etc. But when China is involved, none of this is in play at all. So they get these projects from the Chinese, who are very good at these projects, and they implement them on schedule, or even ahead of schedule. So one is this infrastructure business. The second are the Chinese are very, very active. They are very deep pockets, a lot of financial resources. They have overcapacities. They have built infrastructure all over their own country. Now they want markets outside the country, and this is part of spreading their political their hegemony across the world as a challenge to the United States of America. And they're concentrating on all countries, big and small. That is the second thing. Third is what is the level of expertise in Maldives? I mean, 500,000 people, limited governing class with limited experience, not terribly exposed to the rest of the world, very Islamic and narrow in their thinking. So can they really assess what will happen to them in terms of debt trap or the position they're putting themselves in by becoming over-dependent on China? Okay. They're short. And in this case, there seems to be some pathology in a part of the political establishment or the public in Maldives towards India. But the final point is, we have to be patient. After all, Muizzu didn't win a landslide victory. And if 45-46% of the people are very positive towards India, we should build up that constituency patiently, and see how this works out. You made yourself a very good point with regard to Oli and everybody else, and how things have changed over time. Therefore, as a big country, we have to be careful not to start kicking around immediately until, of course, the thing becomes unacceptable in terms of our security, as, for example, if they give a base to China and that. But short of that, we have to keep persuading them, keep talking to them, nurture our constituencies, put pressure from within the political class and the public in Maldives on the government to tell them what the dangers are of their policy. And then the way he is going, that he will send people for treatment to Thailand and elsewhere and import foodstuff from here and there, this is going to cause a lot of hardship to the people. Education-wise, they're highly dependent on India. Now he wants to give them scholarships to go here and there. Okay. It's not workable. It's petulant. It's childish.
So, Sushant, one of the moot points which Secretary Sibal made as well is, ultimately it boils down to these massive infrastructure projects. China is helping build something called Malé they're trying to shift a large part of their population, a large number of them, 70% I think lives in Malé, and clearly that's, straining the resources of that tiny bunch of islands. So they're trying to move an entire population to Hulu Malé. If you go to Maldives now, the new airport that's been built is in Hulu Malé. Now, unless India starts to compete, maybe not at scale, but in some of the quality of these projects, the Chinese will always have that edge. The question then is, how does India, what is it that India can offer to these countries which is enticing enough for them to say, okay, we don't want to get into this Chinese debt trap diplomacy?
Zaka, the problem with the Chinese debt trap diplomacy is that it's very seductive. Nobody asks that when they are funding that particular project, who's going to pay for it? How are they going to pay for it? This is the same problem in Sri Lanka. When Hambantota was first offered to us, we did a feasibility study and we said that this is not a feasible project. And then the Chinese very, eagerly jumped in. This was Rajapaksa constituency. Rajapaksa wanted a white elephant projects, a number of white elephant projects, and they've landed up with a port where no ship comes, an airport where no plane lands, a highway which hardly any cars travel, and a cricket stadium in which no match is played. Now, if that is your model of development and infrastructure development, good luck to you. But somebody has to pay those bills. Now, the problem is that in the case of India, we've always advised them to go in for sustainable projects, which are economically and financially viable, even if they involve a certain amount of subsidy. But that subsidy cannot be so big that it, empties out the treasury of a country. Now, but if you have leaders like Muizzu and before him Yamin, who are ready to cut their nose to spite my face, then good luck to them. But I must join issue with Ghanshyam Tiwari. The government of India, and I'm sure Mr. Sibal will bear me out on this, it's not the job of the government of India to respond to trolls on Twitter in India who are saying something. Out here in India, trolls will talk about everything and virtually everything under the sun. Whether it makes sense or it does not make sense. It's not the job of the government of India to start clarifying every statement from somebody who has 5 followers. That's not the job of the government of India. But since Mr. Tiwari is so bothered about the reaction in Maldives, I think he should be more bothered about the fact that in Maldives you had a political force which ran an entire election campaign which was vituperatively anti-India. Number one. Number two, and if he's so bothered about trolls, maybe he should start learning a little bit of Chinese and look at the kind of trolling which happens on the Chinese social media, and maybe then he'll change his views about what is happening in India. In any case, India is a free country. I don't want some government to come and tell people out here what they can and cannot say. Unless, of course, Mr. Tiwari is so fond of the Chinese model that he wants to clamp down on everybody.
Ghanshyam, you want to respond to that? I mean, ultimately, government has to go by government-stated policy. It can't keep responding to people on Twitter. And if people feel a certain way, they feel a certain way. How are you saying that is influencing government policy or that is affecting government policy?
It is naive to say that these trolls suddenly one day decided that today we should tweet on Maldives. Right? So there is a trigger movement. That trigger movement is led by BJP establishment, and it is naive to say that it's just people with 5 followers. But be that may, your viewers are not naive. The substantial point is what Secretary Sibal said, that we must wait it out and ensure that people who are not anti-Indian, who like India, who like the kind of infrastructure projects that Member of Parliament Sujit Kumar ji spoke about, are there for long standing. They in due course come back and demonstrate their support for the Indian viewpoint. But that wouldn't happen when you have a massive number of people from the BJP establishment, right-wing establishment, every day saying nasty things about Maldives as a country. Are you building the support base of the current Maldivian establishment, or are you benefiting India? Everyone who's tweeting against Maldives should think that if the political strategy is what Secretary Sibal lays out, then your tweets are harming in India or Indian interests. And who's triggering your tweets? It is the government itself. It is the BJP establishment itself. This is exactly what
doesn't it worry you that, I just gave the examples of Bangladesh, Nepal, and Maldives is the most proximate example, where there is a constituency, elections are decided on anti-India rhetoric. Indian elections are not decided on anti-Maldives rhetoric or anti-Nepal rhetoric or anti-Bangladesh rhetoric. Indian elections are decided on what matters to the people of India. right?
Well,
So does it not worry
did,
you that there is a constituency in these countries which political parties are playing to?
It does not. In fact, it is an opportunity for India, because we are such a large country. It is an opportunity for India to play its soft power, to win affection of our neighboring countries, rather than go a country of 1.4 billion people going out with on a country of 500,000 people. What are we talking about?
Okay.
And say my final point is, the warning signal should have been there when the international press started talking about how in the Israel-Palestine war, that India has become a source of disinformation and apathy in those tragic events, and how the Indian media, a section of Indian media, went out and played out the Israeli
Sushant, a quick response campaign. After that, I'll give Mr. Sujit Kumar the final word. I have to wrap up after that. Yeah.
I wonder what tragedy he's talking about. Is he talking about the tragedy which took place on October 7th? Because I have not heard Mr. Tiwari speak anything on that. But on the larger issue of the Maldives thing, there's an obvious contradiction in what Mr. Tiwari is saying. Now, he's saying that there is a government, which is a BJP government, which has taken a very mature and a very sober stance on what is happening with Maldives. And that same government has this troll army which it has unleashed against Maldives. Now, only Mr. Tiwari, with his convoluted mindset, can make sense of what he's saying, because otherwise I see an obvious contradiction that there is a party which is trying to sabotage its own government. Is that what he's trying to say?
Okay. Sujit Kumar, I'll give you the final word. The question then is, how does one press the reset button with the Maldives? Or should we just bide our time, as Secretary Sybil said, at some point the pro-India political parties will come to power. The rhetoric that Mr. Muizzu is using will run out of steam, it will run its course, and then ultimately the people of Maldives will see how his statements and the statements of members of his party and his government are hurting the Maldives and hurting the Maldivian economy. So there's no other alternative for India but to just bide its time.
Absolutely. I'll echo what Secretary Sybil just said. We have to represent, we have to build the pro-India constituency, and it will happen. It has happened in Nepal, it has happened in Bangladesh, it has happened in many other countries. Secondly, we need to be extremely watchful of the narrative that China is trying to peddle by exaggerating the perception that India is meddling in the internal affairs of Maldives. There is a significant constituency within Maldives which has bought this narrative, and China is known for its false narrative. And finally, we need to see this whole India-Maldives equation not in isolation, but in the larger context of what China is trying to do with India, the string of pearls strategy, or what's happening in Arunachal, or what's happening in the Ladakh.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it at that. Let's see how this plays out. This is, of course, a game of global geostrategic chess that's been going on. India and China are significant players in that. But smaller countries, Maldives, Sri Lanka in our region, and of course, there are countries in the East Asian region, in China's backyard, which are also not particularly friendly to China. They have their own axe to grind against China. So India should cultivate those relationships as well.